Good evening and welcome everyone to our last program in 2020. My name is Ruse Dadaboy and I'm the chair of the Board of Directors of the Richmond World Affairs Council and your host this evening. Today's program is Putin's World, Russia against the West and with the rest. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to welcome our guests, students, and World Affairs Council members to tonight's program. We are so pleased that you were able to join us this evening. We are delighted to have Dr. Angela Stent with us. But first, and before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would like to go over a few housekeeping and administrative matters. As always, our program will start with the presentation, and to ensure audio quality, all participants will be placed on mute during the presentation. After the presentation, we will have our regular question and answer session. And while we cannot see each other's faces, please know that we welcome your participation and we will try to take as many questions from as many of us as long as we have the time. And for the purpose of the Q&A session, we have a little chat box below where you can type your question. It's at the bottom bar of the screen. Now you can also type while the webinar is going on. In that way, if you have a question, you put it in. But after the whole session and the presentation is over, we will read your question so that everyone gets an opportunity to hear the question. After the presentation, we can also unmute you if you happen to have your hand raised so that you can read your question yourself. Now, we would like to thank Data Concepts, one of Richmond's leading IT consulting firms, for their generous support, without which this webinar wouldn't be possible. And now for our speaker. Our speaker, Dr. Angela Stent, joins us today from Washington, D.C., where she's the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. She's also a senior fellow at Brookings. Her notable career includes a position in the Office of Policy Planning at the United States Department of State and as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. Dr. Stent is a former member of the Senior Advisory Panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and has also served on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council for Russia and Central Asia. Dr. Stent holds a master's degree from LSE, from the London School of Economics, and a master's degree and a doctorate from Harvard University. Her academic work include award-winning publications, focus on the political and economic relationship between the United States, Russia, and Europe. Her latest book, and the focus of this evening, is Putin's World, Russia against the West and with the rest, for which she has won the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's prize for the best book on US-Russia relations. Now, if you have not seen it yet, you can find information and the link to purchase the book on our event page. This evening, however, we are so privileged to hear directly from the author herself. Now, I have to make a quote from former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright says, and this is what she tells us, casual observers and seasoned experts will benefit from Dr. Stent's brilliant exploration of Putin's strategy and its disturbing implications for the West. With this, Dr. Stent, I turn it over to you. You're on mute. Okay, lovely.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be addressing you, unfortunately, only virtually. I had to postpone my original in-person event, but I'm delighted to be able to do it now. You know, Russia is always in the news. And just today, President Putin finally acknowledged that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. He was the last world leader to do so. But that's at the same time that we heard that there was a terrible hack of a number of very important departments in our government. They hacked into the Department of Homeland Security that's supposed to protect us from all this. It's the State Department, I think Defense Department. And from what we read in the newspapers, this was also attributed to Russian hackers. So Russia is with us in many different ways and is always an important subject. So I thought what I would do tonight is to begin by talking about my book and some of the issues that I raised there. And then I thought I would talk about what US-Russian relations in a Biden administration might look like. And then I will welcome your questions on all of that. So in my book, I set out to answer three main questions. The first one was, why was the West so wrong in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed in believing that post-Soviet Russia would want to be integrated into the West, would want to have a democratic system, a market economy. And in fact, the West, we did try to integrate Russia. It joined the G8 until it was thrown out in 2014. It joined the World Trade Organization. It was negotiating with the OECD. Why were we also wrong in believing that economic integration would have a beneficial impact on political relations with Russia? Why were we wrong about all of that? The second question is, how has Putin's Russia, with a GDP the size of that of Italy, with a declining population, with crumbling infrastructure, with excessive dependence on oil and gas for its budget, how has Putin's Russia been able to return to the world stage so effectively, going into areas from which Russia withdrew after the Soviet Union collapsed? And why, despite the very tense and adversarial relations between Russia and the West that we see today, why do so many other countries in the world regard Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business? And that's true of countries like China or Brazil or India and many other countries in the world. And hence the subtitle of my book, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And then the third and most difficult question is, how could we have a more productive relationship with Russia going forward? So question number one, why were we wrong at the beginning of the 1990s? And I think the short answer to that is that we thought that the difficulty of dealing with the Soviet Union was because they were communists. But it turns out that the real reason for the difficulties with dealing with them were because they're Russians. And by that, I don't mean any character assassination or ethnic stereotyping. I mean that as Russians, they have a very different view of the world, a very different understanding of the drivers of world politics, and historically view this very differently from the way we do. Now, Vladimir Putin often talks about the Russian idea. He talks about the uniqueness of Russian civilization, that it is different from and superior to that of the West. In my book, I quote a famous 19th century poet, Fyodor Turgenev, who said, there can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles. And he recommended as a solution that Russia should try and sow as much discord as it could in the West. And if that sounds familiar, it should. So there has always been, for centuries really, a view among much of the Russian elite that the West was Russia's antagonist, that they could never really work together properly. There was a suspicion of the West. Putin today talks about the fact that he believes that the United States wants to break up Russia, that it wants regime change. And he criticizes what he sees as the decadent West. He holds Russia up as the harbinger of traditional values, traditional civilization. And he says that the West has been influenced by satanic forces and it has lost its way as true Christian nations. So this is a very unique view of Russian civilization as being distinct from and superior to that of the West. And then I think another important element in this Russianness is the geography of it. If you look at a map, Russia has no natural borders except in the north. And it's always had, in its view, a security problem. Catherine the Great, the 18th century Russian empress, who of course came from Germany, had a famous phrase. She said, "That which stops growing begins to rot. I can only make my population safe if I expand my borders." So this idea of defensive expansionism is at the very core of the way that the Russians see their view in the world. And in fact, there's really no precedent in Russian history for any Russian ruler permanently accepting the loss of territory. Russia has shrank and it's expanded over the centuries, but it's always tried to reincorporate the territories that it's lost. And that goes some way to explaining the nature of the struggle, of the conflict that we see today between Russia and Ukraine. And so today, the Russian Federation defines its security perimeter, not as the borders of Russia itself, but as the borders of the post-Soviet space. And so from the Kremlin's point of view, if the West is seen to be encroaching on the borders of the former Soviet Union, i.e. Ukraine, that is seen as a direct threat to Russia, even though the West is certainly not coming up to Russia's borders. And that's another, I think, very important concept. Now, second question, how is Putin's Russia, able to play its hand so well? After all, when he took over 20 years ago, the Russian economy was declining. They'd had a financial crash. The country was in chaos. Well, there are two reasons for it. And the first one is that Putin had a plan. When he took over, when he was handed over the reins of power in the year 2000 by an ailing Boris Yeltsin, he said that he was determined to do two things: to restore a strong state with a strong ruler, and secondly, to restore Russia to its rightful place as a great power. And so he had this plan going forward in a way that the West didn't have a plan. We believed when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Cold War was over, that the world would want to ascribe to our view, if you like, of a liberal international order. That certainly was not Putin's view. But the second reason why Putin has done so well in terms of foreign policy is that Russia has been able to take advantage, and he has particularly, of opportunities presented to it by a divided West, a distracted West, a West that really wasn't focusing a lot on what Russia was doing. Now, Putin has really two elements in his training that have made him particularly adept at being a strong tactician. I don't think he's a great strategist, but he is a strong tactician. And the first is that he's trained as a KGB case officer. And when you read his autobiographical interviews from 20 years ago, when he first became president, he said that as a KGB case officer in East Germany, he quote unquote worked with people and documents. So he was trained, obviously, to try and understand people's weaknesses and take advantage of them. But the other thing you have to understand about Vladimir Putin and some of his successes is that he is a judo champion. Now, we often think about Russians as being great chess players, which they are, but Putin, he really found his way out of a rather difficult and hard-scrabble childhood when he started learning martial arts. It was a particularly Russian combination of judo and other martial arts, but it's mainly judo. And today you can actually buy books with his name on it that are about judo. And so in judo, you can be weaker than your opponent, but if you understand your opponent's distraction and how to take advantage of their weaknesses, you can still prevail. And so I think he's used those skills quite successfully as Russia has taken advantage of these opportunities presented by the West to return to the world stage. Now, in my book, I detail, I would say, two of Putin's foreign policy successes, what I consider to be. And the first one is the relationship with China. Something that is talked about a lot today in the US as we look at this burgeoning strategic partnership between the two countries. Don't forget that 50 years ago, Soviet and Chinese soldiers were shooting at each other over their common border. Today, Xi Jinping and Putin call each other their best friends. I have a picture in my book of Vladimir Putin teaching Xi Jinping how to make blini, Russian pancakes, at the same time as their armies are taking part in joint maneuvers. China came to Russia's assistance in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine. The West sought to isolate Russia. It imposed sanctions on Russia. It kicked Russia out of the G8. It took other actions against Russia. But it was unable to isolate Russia because China came in. The first thing it did was to sign a $400 billion natural gas deal with Russia. They'd been negotiating this deal for years, and the Russians had never been willing to accept the low price, in their view, that the Chinese wanted to pay for the gas. But in March of 2014, they didn't have any option because of the Western sanctions. So they signed this gas deal, and since then you've had ever closer, as I say, military ties between the two countries, economic ties between the two countries. These are both leaders who hold a series of grievances against the West, particularly the United States. They feel that the United States created a world order after 1991, which didn't take their interest into account. They both talk about a post-West order. They mean different things by it, I think, but that's what they talk about. And here are two authoritarian leaders who will always back each other up, whatever they do. So the Russians will never criticize the Chinese, including for what they're doing to the Uyghur population, say. The Chinese will never officially criticize the Russians for imprisoning journalists, poisoning people. They never get any domestic criticism. And from Putin's point of view, this is an existential issue. So when people in the United States talk about, well, we should try and wean Russia away from China, Putin really believes that the United States is interested in effecting regime change in Russia, and he sees that as a threat, whereas he knows that China will always back him up. And so he has really made the choice, Putin, to that Russia become China's junior partner instead of becoming the United States' junior partner. Now, there are a lot of asymmetries in this relationship. China is a rising power, Russia isn't. There are also potential conflicts in their common backyard, Central Asia, which could erupt, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And there are other potential areas, particularly the Russian Far East, which is being depopulated very rapidly. You have 6 million people in the Russian Far East. You have 125 million Chinese on the other side of the border. And don't forget, the Russian Far East belonged to China until about 1860. And so you occasionally, in the Chinese sort of social media sphere, people ruminate about this. But this is not a problem at the moment. It could become in the future. So at the moment, the relationship with China seems pretty solid. And when asked a few weeks ago about whether he could see a Russian-Chinese military alliance, Putin said not now, but maybe in the future. And the second area where I think Russia has been remarkably successful in the last few years has been its return to the Middle East. It withdrew more or less from the Middle East after the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't have the wherewithal to stay there. And then in 2015, Russia took advantage of the opportunity to come back in the Middle East when it looked as if Bashar al-Assad in Syria was about to be defeated in the Syrian civil war. Syria had retained its ties with Russia after the Soviet collapse. And so Russia began this aerial bombing campaign, and it has succeeded in keeping Assad in power. And there was another reason why Russia went back into the Middle East then, and that was because the second largest number of foreign fighters for the Islamic State, in fact, came from Russia. They were either Russian citizens or they were Central Asian migrant workers. And so the idea was to kill these people in Syria as opposed to having to deal with terrorism and extremism in Russia itself. So Putin has used this re-entry into the Middle East now to develop relations with really all players on all sides of all issues in the Middle East. Unlike the Soviet period, when the Soviet Union normally only dealt with countries that at least said they were socialist leaning. So Russia, of course, has a relationship with Iran, with all of the Shia groups. It has relations with all of the Sunni states and Sunni groups. And in the last few years has developed quite a close relationship with Israel. In fact, its two new partners in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia and Israel, both US allies, obviously. These two countries, I think, both hope that Russia can use its influence on Iran to temper Iranian ambitions in the region. It's not clear that Russia can, but that's, I think, part of the reason for these relations. Also, in the Saudi case, it's a question of oil prices. It's the Russian cooperation with OPEC. That broke down briefly in March of this year when you had an oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. In fact, it was President Trump who then intervened and got both countries to agree to stabilize the production. So oil is an important part of it, but the Saudis are buying arms from Russia, and that relationship's also developing many more dimensions. And then in the case of Israel, you have 1.3 million Israeli citizens who hail from the former Soviet Union. You have visa-free travel between the two countries. You have a lot of business in many different areas between Russia and Israel. And from Israel's point of view, Russia can and does sometimes exercise a restraining hand on what Hezbollah is doing in the Syrian civil war when it threatens Israeli security. So you suddenly have Russia really as a player there who's regarded more or less as an honest broker. Now, let me turn for a few minutes to Russia's relations with Europe, and then I will start talking about the United States. So the Russian relationship with Europe has really deteriorated significantly since the annexation of Crimea and the launch of this war in southeastern Ukraine, where more than 14,000 people have been killed. And the war is not over. I mean, there are casualties every week. Europe, of course, is not united in its view of Russia. The Baltic States and Poland, I would say, take the most dim view of Russia and want to pursue the harshest policies. You have countries like Hungary, Italy, Spain, the Czech Republic, who've taken, and Romania and Bulgaria, who've taken a somewhat more benign view of Russia. But Germany really is the country I just want to talk about for a few moments. So Germany has always been Russia's major advocate in Europe. The Germans feel that they have a historical responsibility, obviously, for what happened in the 20th century, for two world wars, particularly for World War II, where at least 25 or 29 million, I think is now the figure, Soviet soldiers died in this war. And they feel a responsibility to Russia because Gorbachev was willing to allow Germany to reunite in 1990 without much pushback at all. And Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, she grew up in East Germany. She speaks fluent Russian. She's, I would say, the world leader who understands Putin best because she did grow up in a police state. She won all kinds of prizes for Russian language when she was a teenager. And so she and Putin can literally speak to each other with no interpreters there. But Germany has become increasingly disillusioned with what's happened in Russia, and particularly after the annexation of Crimea that really shattered the kind of post-Cold War agreement consensus that whatever one might think of the borders of the post-Soviet space, everybody agreed to accept that those were the borders of new countries and not to question them. And Russia, by annexing Crimea, had really questioned that whole consensus, broken it down. And then, of course, more recently, you've had the revelation that the Bundestag computers were hacked by Russian agents. There was interference in the last German election. You've had a very public assassination of a Chechen dissident in the Tiergarten, one of the main beautiful gardens in Berlin. And then, of course, most recently, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. Now, a quite extraordinary YouTube video emerged yesterday, which has English subtitles to it. We now know who it was who poisoned Alexei Navalny. This is all the result of the work of an investigative unit called Bellingcat, plus a Russian, opposition media outlet. But it's been confirmed by other people. We know who exactly who poisoned him. And it's clear that these were not people acting on their own. The Germans have directly accused the Russians of being involved in the poisoning. They've traced where the poison came from. The Russians have now accused Germany of poisoning Alexei Navalny. I won't go on, but you can see that the relationship is really particularly between the Chancellor and Putin has really deteriorated greatly. And so Germany is the one that has really held the line on all of the sanctions that the European Union imposed on Russia. Interestingly enough, just last week, the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, received a delegation from the AfD, which is the extreme right-wing nationalist party in Germany that does have seats in the Bundestag. So that, I think, was the Russian signal to the Germans that they didn't like what the Germans, the fact that Mr. Navalny is now in Germany recovering. Anyway, that relationship has deteriorated. And in general, the Russian relationship with Europe has certainly deteriorated. And the Russians tend to support all of the Eurosceptical parties in Europe, be they on the right, be they on the left. So now let me turn to the question of US-Russian relations under a Biden administration. And I'm just checking my clock here. So I think the first thing to say about a Biden administration, or the first thing to acknowledge, is that ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, each American administration has come into power saying it wants a reset of relations with Russia, that surely there must be a better way of dealing with Russia. And all of these attempts at resets have failed, the exception being really the first Obama term, because Dmitry Medvedev was then the president of Russia, even though Putin himself was still the power behind the throne. It was Mr. Medvedev who dealt with President Obama, who was able to negotiate with him. And in fact, in 2009, it was then Vice President Joe Biden who went to the Munich Security Conference and announced the reset. And so he was, in fact, the messenger for that. There won't be any reset this time. The Biden administration is quite clear about that. So I think you do not have an administration coming into office saying we're going to be able to do things really much better and differently. And the other thing to note really is that there's much more continuity in US-Russian relations between Republican and Democratic administrations because the issues don't change. And I think the real, if you like, exception to the rule, aberration, is the last 4 years, where you had a president who uniformly praised Russia, was never willing to say a word of criticism to Vladimir Putin. In fact, said that he believed Putin's denials of election interference over the opinion of his own intelligence agencies. And by the way, President Putin reciprocated. He never criticized President Trump. He criticized America and the American people. So this was really an exception. But we've just come out of 4 years where you had a president who had one aspirational policy toward Russia, and the rest of the administration, of the executive branch and the Congress, took a much tougher line. So what did we actually have in the last 4 years? The first thing we had was that Russia has become a toxic subject domestically in a way that it hasn't been since the era of Senator Joseph McCarthy. And that's because of the knowledge of Russian interference in 2016 and the belief on the part of some people who do not support President Trump that in fact he's only in power because of what the Russians did. I don't think that's true, but there's certainly the belief there. What the Russians did in 2016 was to take advantage, coming back to Putin again as a good tactician, of all of the polarization in American society. And they fed into that, they amplified it. They joined all these social media groups. There was cyber interference, but they didn't invent these divisions. They were just able to take advantage of them. And I think even the people in the Obama administration will admit that toward the latter part of 2016, the Obama administration too late cottoned on to what was going on. So anyway, Russia has become a toxic subject, and therefore it was impossible for President Trump to achieve anything that he wanted to with Russia, a new deal with Russia. Why can't we get along with Russia? And at every turn, he couldn't do it because because his executive branch, in essence, and it's worth looking at that part of John Bolton's memoirs, was fiercely against it. So what did we actually accomplish in the last 4 years with Russia? What we mainly have are rafts and rafts of sanctions and diplomatic expulsions. So sanctions began at the very end of the Obama administration. Then there were far more sanctions in 2017. I won't repeat all of the alphabet soup of all of the different pieces of legislation, but many of them. We expelled a large number of diplomatic personnel whom we said were not, in fact, diplomats. We closed down the Russian consulates in Seattle, in San Francisco. We closed down the Russian so-called recreational facilities outside Washington and New York. So just rafts of these sanctions. Beyond that, there was, I think, 1 or 2 times when strategic stability talks were held between the Russians and Americans, but they didn't really achieve very much. And then belatedly, the Trump administration started to talk to the Russians about arms control. The US pulled out of the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons, saying that the Russians had cheated. The Russians pulled out. The Trump administration pulled out of the Open Skies Agreement, which gave us insight into some of the things that the Russians were doing and vice versa. And it belatedly started to talk about the possible renewal of New START, which is the agreement covering strategic nuclear weapons. Don't forget that between us, the US and Russia, we have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And therefore, we have a particular responsibility for global safety. There's an interesting piece today that just came out in Foreign Affairs by Ernie Moniz and another co-author, talking about really the dangers that we face if we don't take these issues seriously. But the Trump administration insisted that China's nuclear weapons be counted in any future agreement with Russia, and the Chinese said, no, thank you, and they haven't changed their tune since then. So that's really where we are in terms of the US-Russian relationship. Now, having said all that, our government tells us that the Russians really didn't interfere that much in the presidential election this year. We could speculate about why. And we also saw just a few weeks before the election, Vladimir Putin sort of hedging his bets and coming out and out of the blue saying that he didn't really think that Hunter Biden had done anything wrong, that whatever his business dealings were in Russia and Ukraine as well, he didn't see anything to criticize about that. So he was sort of hedging his bets in terms of his own views about what he wanted as the outcome of the election. Now, with an incoming Biden administration, there are a couple of things I think that will be very important. The first one will be, if you like, the reprofessionalization and reconstitution of the US Department of State. In the last 4 years, a lot of normal diplomatic channels have atrophied, particularly in dealing with Russia. We had channels of communication that just haven't been there for the past 4 years. And we know that there have been far more political appointees doing things in the State Department, and a number of professionals have left for various reasons. So the revitalization of the State Department, I think, will be a very important first step, and the revitalization, if you like, of traditional American diplomacy. And then the second point is a revitalization and a recommitment to our alliances, particularly to our allies in Europe, to NATO, which of course President Trump at various points said he wanted the US to pull out of, and particularly with the relationship with Germany, for reasons that one can only speculate on. President Trump himself was particularly harsh on Germany and Chancellor Merkel. So hopefully there'll be a revival of relations with our allies. And in terms of Russia, in the Obama administration, there was close US-German cooperation on dealing with Russia, on sanctions, also with other European countries. And presumably that will also be a centerpiece, at least in the beginning of the Biden administration. So I think the first act that you will see vis-a-vis Russia is that the Biden administration will have 2 weeks to renew the New START treaty. It expires on February the 5th. If it is renewed verbatim, and it can be renewed for another 5 years, the Senate will not have to vote on it. Last time it was pretty difficult to get through the Senate. And of course, we still don't know who's going to control the Senate. And if the Republicans control it, it would be very difficult, I think, to get another arms control agreement through. if it were a new one. So there will be, I think, be a move right at the beginning to renew the New START treaty. And the Russians have given every indication that they want to do this too, despite the fact that the Russians are developing all kinds of fancy looking hypersonic and other weapons. Russia really doesn't have the economic wherewithal, particularly as a result of the COVID pandemic and what it's done to the Russian economy, to spend huge amounts of money on an expensive arms race. So one assumes that this will be a first act by the Biden administration. Now, beyond that, I think there will be a re-examination of the sanctions regime. The Biden people have not said that they're against sanctions, but they've said that they want to re-examine whether the sanctions are effective, what smart sanctions would look like, even though these sanctions are now, of course, they're part of congressional legislation. The US Congress did that deliberately in 2017 because they didn't want President Trump to use his executive authority to somehow dilute the sanctions. So there will be a re-examination of sanctions. There could be more sanctions. Some of this, I think, will be tied to what happened during the election campaign. But of course, having now read that there's been this massive hack of all of these US government agencies, I'm not sure what the response to that will be. So there'll be some movement on sanctions, but it may not necessarily be to lessen them. Another thing that we know is that a Biden administration will be much more active in Ukraine. Since President Trump's impeachment in January, we really have taken a back seat in Ukraine. We don't have a special envoy there. We don't have anyone. We have State Department diplomats who are still involved, but this hasn't been a high priority. It will be for a Biden administration, and that could cause problems with Russia. It could also involve more discussion with Russia if the US revives the kind of diplomacy where it talks both to Russia and to Ukraine, and if it maybe coordinates more with the Europeans, with Germany and France, in their attempts to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. A Biden administration might rejoin the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear agreement. It's not clear that it will, but it might. In that case, that would be one area, again, where we would be working with the Russians, which is what we did during the Obama administration. And in fact, President Obama at the time praised Russia's role in enabling this agreement to be concluded. And I think another area where we could see US-Russian cooperation is climate change. So the Biden administration, of course, will go back to the Paris agreements. It will focus on climate. John Kerry is now our special climate representative. Interestingly enough, Mr. Putin, who until quite recently said things like, oh, there's nothing wrong if Russia gets a little bit warmer, we'll be able to grow more things. A few weeks ago in his Valdai speech, he talked about the dangers of global climate change. He said that Russia had to take a much more active role. So it's possible that this is an area where the two countries could cooperate. And the same might be true in some aspects of what's happening in the Arctic. I mean, there's competition with Russia in the Arctic too, but in terms of the environmental and climate implications of what's happening in the Arctic. And I guess the other possible way where we might cooperate more with the Russians if the US rejoins the WHO and if there's more cooperation on the global pandemic, on dealing with global public health issues. Now, beyond that, it gets more difficult, I would say. A Biden administration will certainly be committed to democracy promotion, to the promotion of human rights, and to fighting global kleptocracy, trying to prevent dark money from being laundered in this country and having too much influence on our own political system. These are clearly all areas where we're going to meet any resistance from the Russians if we try and pursue it there. And I think the other thing to remember is that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin know each other. They've met several times. President-elect Biden was quite tough about Russia on the election during the campaign. He talked in one of the debates, he said that Russia was the #1 enemy of the United States. President Putin has also not had lots of words of praise for President-elect Biden. So this is not something, in contrast to what you've seen in the last 4 years, where you're going to see the two leaders getting together and sort of slapping each other on the back and being pally. That's not what it's going to be. But they're both obviously seasoned political leaders. They're both pragmatists. And, I think what one can hope for is a normalization of the relationship, which is to say there are areas where we have to deal with the Russians, where we do have common interests with them, and those that we should pursue. And we probably shouldn't pursue things that are going to end up as dead ends, but those areas where we have to work together, and we should, which will bring at least an element of normalcy to this. And I think the final word I'll say here is that a Biden administration has also made it clear that they want to reach out to civil society in Russia. I think it's very important to remember that the Kremlin doesn't speak for all Russians. The latest opinion polls by the Levada organization, which is the most respected and the only independent remaining polling organization in Russia, shows that about 1/3 of the Russian population really doesn't support the system and would like something else. So it's important to have to the extent that one can, to encourage exchanges, to reach out to Russian civil society, even though it's becoming more difficult to do that because the Russians are trying to prevent that. So I think it's just 6:30. I was told to stop at 6:30. I will be very happy to take your questions on anything I've said or any other things that I haven't covered. Thank you.
All right, I see a few people have their hands raised. And Brenda, you had your hand raised for a while. Let me unmute. I enabled you to unmute. So if you still have a question, you can unmute yourself and speak. If not, you're always welcome to type your question as well. Anne Burks, I see you have your hand raised. I will, nope, you lowered it. All right, let's look at the chat.
I think there's a question about Russian-Chinese relations.
Yes, yes.
In the chat. Okay, I'm happy to talk about it more.
Dr. Stent, let me interrupt you. Just I'll read it anyways, just so that everybody knows the question.
Oh, of course, you need to read the question. Sorry. Okay.
Can you talk a bit more about your outlook on Sino-Russian relations in the medium and long term? Chinese-Russian relations have a checkered past. Is it inevitable that they will work together against Western interests in the future? And how worried should we be about this?
I mean, nothing's inevitable. I think I would preface this by saying that they do appear to have a relationship that's getting closer now, because from the Chinese point of view, it's very useful for China. Russia is a great energy source for China. China needs more energy. But having said that, just on the energy part of it, in 20 or 30 years' time, when people are driving electric cars and they're moving away from hydrocarbons, then Russia's significance as an energy provider, both to Europe and to Asia, will clearly diminish. But that's not immediate. That's sort of in the longer term. So right now, for China, again, it imports a lot of Russian energy. The Russians, of course, import finished goods from China. Huawei is operating in Russia. There are different partnerships there. That's also useful for the Chinese. The Russians usually back the Chinese up in the United Nations Security Council, not always, but usually do. So again, in that forum, it's useful to have Russia there. The Russians will never criticize the Chinese for anything that they're doing domestically. And I would also argue that the Trump administration, in a sense, pushed Russia and China closer together through dual policies of a trade war with China and rafts of sanctions on Russia. How that's going to change in a Biden administration, I don't know. It will depend on, obviously, how a Biden administration deals with China, and there are question marks about that. Now, in the longer run, The Chinese believe that there is a G2, that the US and China are the two great global powers, and they do not believe that Russia is in that league, whereas the Russians believe they would like to divide the world, if you like, into a tripartite Yalta. So China, Russia, and the US, we all have our spheres of influence. We leave other people's sphere of influence alone. The US stops trying to, in the Russian view, interfere in its backyard. The Chinese don't view things that way. Again, they view Russia as a second-rate global power, and a power that's not on the rise. And when you talk to Chinese experts on Russia in a more private setting, they will always express amazement that Russia is unable to modernize its economy, that it remains a petro-state in many ways, dependent on these hydrocarbon exports, and that cannot produce manufactured goods that other people want to buy. So in that sense, there's also, I think, a skepticism on the Chinese part. So in the longer run, if you look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, there's really nothing in it for Russia. I've attended conferences in Moscow with Chinese and Russian, where the Chinese say this is a win-win situation. The Russians are, do well from this. But look at the map. The Belt and Road projects don't run through Russia, but they certainly run through Central Asia. So this is where Russia views itself as the main security provider in Central Asia, and China is the main economic power there. But once China has built roads, railways, pipelines, whatever, through Central Asia, of course, it becomes a security provider too. So I think in the longer run, there is going to be more tension in their shared neighborhood. Right now, it's being managed. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization where they're working together, but that could change going forward. And then, in the longer run, but I don't know how many decades that is, you wonder about the depopulated Russian Far East. I mean, we had a glimpse of that a couple of months ago. The Russian embassy in Beijing celebrated the anniversary of the founding of Vladivostok, right there near the Chinese-Russian border. And the Chinese social media went wild. And obviously, you know that the social media in China are controlled. But you had journalists and even some officials sort of making fun of this and saying, well, where Vladivostok is, it used to be ours, and one day it will be. So again, I'm sure it's not in the immediate future. I think in the medium term, you will probably see those two countries working together, often against US interests, but that'll also depend, I think, on US policy. And I think, on the one hand, unlike President Putin, President Xi Jinping immediately congratulated President-elect Biden on his election win. So you could see Chinese moves to try and bridge the gap in this deteriorating relationship with the US. And then you could see a different configuration.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Oliver Fisk, and he would like to know if we can learn anything from how the Baltic states have fought back against the Russian disinformation.
Well, the Baltic states obviously have had the experience of being the whole government being hacked by the Russians, the Estonians in particular, a few years ago when they moved the statue of a Soviet soldier from the center of Tallinn to the outskirts, and they suffered a major cyber attack, closing everything down. Estonia is very much a digital government where much is there online. And as a result of that, they've obviously learned lessons and they've steeled themselves. So I think we can learn something from the three Baltic states. And you can also, learn from a country like Lithuania that decided it didn't want to be so dependent on Russian gas imports, and therefore it built its own LNG terminal at considerable cost, obviously, and so it can now import LNG from other countries. So there are many different ways, and I think all three Baltic states, particularly since the events in Ukraine, and the questioning about how defensible these countries are, if there were to be a conflict between Russia and the West, I think they've definitely focused also on their own domestic military defense now, understanding that they need to be as self-reliant as they can in the face of their very large and sometimes menacing neighbor.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions here. I see in the chat, Rex Homlin would like to know, in your view, is Mr. Putin still a communist?
Oh, no, no, no. I think he gave up being a communist a long time ago. I think you can first of all question how many people were really communists, even KGB people, toward the end of the Soviet Union. I think they were Russian nationalists, and I think they dressed this in a veneer of language about Soviet socialism, but I don't necessarily think they were really communists. I mean, Putin's job when he finally went back to St. Petersburg and left the KGB was as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, responsible for foreign economic contacts. And so he basically was present at the creation of this very strange capitalist economy that grew up in Russia in the 1990s. And we know that he and a number of his friends, who then later on became very wealthy, joined together, they owned property. He was doing business, both with people in Russia and in other parts of the world. So he's certainly not a communist. Interestingly enough, in 2017, for the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Kremlin really had a dilemma. Were they going to sort of commemorate this at all? How were they going to commemorate it? Because if you think about the fact that Putin has a fear of color revolutions, of the people out in the streets deposing the rulers, 1917 was the mother of all color revolutions, and it then brought in this communist system. So he's criticized communism, he's criticized to some extent the Bolshevik Revolution. He has to be careful because there are obviously people around who still have strong feelings. He has been careful in what he said about Stalin. He's criticized some of the repressions, but he's also said that Stalin was an efficient manager. But I think what you can see Putin as a Russian nationalist, first and foremost, and also a believer in the kind of capitalism that has made him and the people around him quite wealthy.
Rose, you have a question.
Oh dear. Yes. I was curious. Do you think Biden will be able to stand up to Putin if Russia messes with Ukraine? Will Biden continue offering Ukraine military support? Under the Obama administration, they did support, but it wasn't like lethal weapons and things like that.
Yeah, I think that they will continue now to supply the lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. I think if you go back to the Obama administration, I think President Obama himself certainly didn't think, he thought that it would escalate tensions with Russia to supply the lethal defensive weapons. I'm not sure that that was the then Vice President Biden's view of that. So I think in Ukraine, there's going to be a concerted effort to, first of all, work with the Ukrainians on the perennial problems they have of dealing with corruption. President Zelensky, who was elected with so much enthusiasm a couple of years ago, is sort of flailing now. So yes, you really need to support him and to try and convince him that Ukraine has to do the right things if it wants to get another IMF loan. But there will certainly be support for Ukraine militarily. I don't see that. I don't see that diminishing, and I think Ukraine will. I think the whole of the post-Soviet space will also rise in terms of priorities for a Biden administration. They've been very outspoken on what's happening in Belarus. There are some people. I think that the Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the person who believes that she was elected the rightful president of Belarus. She's now in exile. She may come to the inauguration. So I think you're going to see a more active US policy in Russia's neighborhood than you've seen in the Trump administration.
Thank you.
The next question, you may have already addressed most of that right now, but there's also the question of how important is Ukraine, still to Russia?
So I think from Putin's point of view, let's go back. Let's go back to what Vladimir Putin said to President George W. Bush in 2008 at the one NATO conference he attended in Bucharest in Romania. And that was when the Bush administration wanted to give Ukraine a NATO perspective. And Putin said to Bush, you must recognize, George, that Ukraine isn't really a country. The western part of it used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the rest of it was part of the Russian Empire. So I think there is a fundamental belief among many Russians that Ukraine really isn't a separate country, that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers, sisters, whatever, and that at least in the eastern part of Ukraine really belongs to Russia. They've always had trouble seeing Ukraine as a separate country. And, you know, when Crimea was annexed, I was shocked by how many people I knew who normally were the kind of Russians who interact with Westerners, who spent time in Europe or the United States, and who otherwise you would think were rather sort of global in their outlook. They were very happy by the annexation of Crimea and what they considered the rightful reunification of Crimea with Russia. So I think that from the point of view of many Russians, they really don't view Ukraine as a separate country. What's changing is that I think younger Russians maybe have a different view of this. Certainly more liberally minded Russians understand that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country and that Russia should get out of Ukraine. And I think what the Russian actions in Ukraine, and particularly their support for the separatists and the fact that you have Russian troops in Ukraine, has done is to consolidate in Ukraine much more of a coherent national identity, where you don't have the eastern part of Ukraine thinking about its identity so differently from the West. So I think things are changing there. I think it will still take generational change of quite a few generations until you get maybe a majority of Russians really accepting that Ukraine is a separate and a different country.
Thank you. The next question comes from June Hoy, and she would like to, oh, I'm sorry, that was the one we just read. The next one is, would you expect Russia to pursue any more territorial expansion over the next 4 years of the Biden presidency? Is there strategy in Belarus or the Baltic States to annex land like in Crimea?
So in terms of Belarus, I think what Russia is now trying to do is to pressure Mr. Lukashenko into constitutional reform, changing the constitution, diluting the powers maybe of the president, and then persuading him that there should be a leadership transition. So I think in Belarus, the Russians are looking to make in the next year or so, or maybe less than that, a transition to a different president who will still have close relations with Russia. They are watching this very carefully. If the situation changed in Belarus, I mean, you still have demonstrations every day, every week. The people are out in the streets. They don't want to accept the result of the election. But if you had a situation where the security forces were deserting Lukashenko, which they haven't done yet, the security forces are out there, they're beating people up, they're torturing people, people are being imprisoned. If they deserted Lukashenko and they started to side with the people, then the Russians would have a much more difficult problem, because that really would look like a color revolution. Russia has troops in Belarus. It owns most of the energy infrastructure in Belarus. It does see Belarus as its westernmost outpost. And then you might actually have a Russian intervention, but they've tried to avoid it so far. They didn't do it in the beginning. And I think they're going to do whatever they can to ensure that you do have a transition away from Lukashenko to someone who's acceptable to Russia, but also to more of the Belarusian people. Whether that's possible, I don't know, but I think that that's what they want. I think in terms of the Baltic states, they recognize that the Baltic states are members of NATO, that they're still harassing them. You have incidents in the air, you have incidents at sea, there's still cyber interference going on. But I think the fear that you would have some kind of Russian military invasion of the Baltic states is probably misplaced. as I say, they can do things with cyber and other areas which could still make life difficult for the Baltic states. But if you think about it, the Russian economy will contract about 6% this year. Combined result, well, it's mainly COVID and then the sanctions as well. Most of what Russia does internationally, they do on the cheap. What they're doing in Syria doesn't cost them that much. And they use, of course, these private military formations, mercenary groups like Wagner, to do a lot of the military operations there. What they're doing in Venezuela isn't that expensive. Anything that would really cost them serious money in terms of attacking another country, I think they would also have to think about very carefully because their economic situation isn't that good.
Thank you. Ann Burks asked if you could compare the present Russian support of Putin to earlier support, maybe that of 3 years ago, 5 years ago. Has anything changed? What has changed?
So when Putin came to power, he promised the Russians, basically the deal he had with them is, if you don't criticize the government and you don't, undertake active opposition, I promise you your standard of living will rise, your life will get better. And for the first 8 years, that happened because oil prices rose. So from 2000 to 2008, Russian GDP grew by 7% a year, largely, again, because of high oil prices. And so a majority of Russians, even those who don't necessarily like Putin, admitted and saw that their lives, their standard of living was getting better. And so he did become quite popular. Then, of course, you had the crash in 2008, oil prices tanked, and ever since then, they've risen, they've fallen, but he hasn't been able to deliver the same economic benefits to his population since then. Now, what else has he done? He promised them stability. So in many ways, they can see that they have a stable country. In 2014, one of the ways he dealt with economic difficulties was by annexing Crimea, the sort of patriotic response. As his government got more repressive, he told the Russian people, the West is out to get us, but we'll survive. We've survived before, and we've got Crimea now. It's ours. And so again, his popularity rose. Where we are now, I quoted earlier a poll by the Levada organization that shows that about 1/3 of the population doesn't support Putin. I think his popularity ratings officially are something like 60%, which isn't bad for a Western politician, but they used to be sort of in the 80%. He managed to get a pretty high turnout for people to vote on the new constitution. And the new constitutional amendments will enable Putin to remain in power until 2036. Repression has grown in Russia. Just now, they've passed some more laws, making it very difficult for people to gather, to protest. If they have any connection with foreigners, they can be called a foreign agent. He's also just passed laws which will give him lifetime immunity from any prosecution. And also he can stay in power till 2036. So what we see this year has been increasing repression, and the Russian population is also not happy with the way he's handled the COVID crisis. If you look at public opinion polls, Russia had a public health problem before COVID hit. And if you're in one of the major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, obviously the facilities are very good. But if you're in provincial areas, they're not. People are also upset with their economic situation, the fallout from COVID, the fact that they don't feel that the Russian government has given enough support to small businesses, to people who are losing their employment. So I think in general, there's more complaining about it. But the other thing that the public opinion polls show is there is no alternative. So for a lot of Russians, it's not that they actively think the Putin regime is great. They don't see any alternative. They go about sort of living their lives as they are, and there's such huge deterrence to public opposition that this is a situation that could go on for quite a long time. But increasingly, and again, younger people look at this aging administration as a president who's been in power for 20 years. For some young people, it's the only president they've ever known. And they wonder, couldn't there be something different? And you certainly see that again in some of the urban areas, in some of these local elections, opposition people getting elected on these municipal councils and trying for something better. But I think no one should be under any illusion that this is a government, that's going to collapse anytime soon, or that they're going to be large-scale street protests. And having said that, all people who are so-called Russia experts know that Russia can surprise you. I was listening in a very interesting webinar yesterday with Russian sociologists talking about precisely these issues and quoting someone who says, sometimes Russia can collapse in 3 days. So that's another way of looking at it.
Thank you. Can you speak on Putin's view on Lukashenko's proclamation that he would resign if a new constitution is adopted?
So I think I already addressed that. I mean, that's what the Russians want. They want there to be a new constitution, and they want him to resign, and they want to have another leader.
Right. Thank you. Why did Putin choose to go after Navalny in 2020? Was Navalny not already a well-known figure in the past? So
interestingly, if you watch this YouTube video that I guess came out yesterday, Navalny's explanation for this, and we now know that the people who poisoned him had been following him around for up to 3 years. He attributed it to the fact that he, in 2017, announced that he wanted to run for the presidency. Now, he wasn't allowed to run for the presidency. He couldn't get his name on the ballot. That's his explanation, is because he directly challenged President Putin for the presidency, which he hadn't done before. And we now know, again, if you watch the YouTube video, that this was not the first attempt to poison him, but it was a more successful one, as we know. So that's his explanation for it. I think it's also, I would speculate, the main thing people like Navalny and his organization are focusing on now are the Duma elections, which are the Russian parliament elections that are coming up next September. Now, you might sit, as I do here in the United States, and say, how important is that really, since the parliament is more or less a rubber stamp? But the fact that the party, Putin's party, although he's not the head of it, the United Russia Party, has a super majority in the parliament, that is viewed by the Putin administration as a sign of their own legitimacy. In other words, they want the United Russia Party to get an overwhelming number of seats, because this will reinforce the legitimacy of the system. So what Navalny and his people have been doing is going around and telling people to do smart voting. So that is to say, if you live in an area where the Communist Party is doing quite well, vote for the communists, even if you're not a communist, because that will mean that United Russia doesn't get in. And so I think one of the fears of Putin and other people, local politicians too, is that if the Navalny type campaign is successful, as it was, for instance, in Khabarovsk, where there have been protests going on now for months in Siberia, you will then have elected into positions of power either people from the Communist Party, or in the case of Khabarovsk, the so-called Liberal Democratic Party, which is in fact a sort of conservative right-wing party. And I think that represents certainly another danger from the Kremlin's point of view.
Thank you. We have one,
Sorry,
two, three more questions.
I apologize.
While Dr. Stent is getting ready, David Greenberg, let me.
Sorry, here I am.
David Greenberg, you are allowed to unmute if you would like to pose your question. Somehow we're having problems with that. I apologize. If you would just please type your question real quick, we'll try to get through the last ones. Ruth, you had another question.
Okay, lovely. You know, people see Putin as a showman with all that swagger, and he likes to present himself thus. Can you tell us a few personal things about him?
So, for the past, I guess it's 16 years now, I've gone every year. I didn't go this year, it was virtual, but I've gone to these Valdai conferences in Russia where they bring foreign experts on Russia. And we meet with different Russian politicians, we meet with Russian experts, and then we always have a meeting with President Putin. And so I've observed, obviously, over these years. So first of all, he really is someone who knows his brief. You know, he will, you know, he'll be asked, and you know, you can ask him any question you want to answer it. He knows an enormous amount about things like energy, not surprisingly, but other issues too. He'll correct the interpreters, even though we don't quite know how much English he speaks, but he corrects them. He also has a very interesting view of history, which comes through. At one point, he was asked by a British journalist, why is Lenin still embalmed in Red Square? And so Putin said to him, where are you from? He said, I'm from Great Britain. Putin didn't miss a beat. And he said, well, why do you still have statues of Oliver Cromwell in Parliament Square? You know, Cromwell, Lenin, it's the same thing. They were revolutionaries. They killed the monarch. And so the questioner then said, well, but, you know, we don't have, Cromwell isn't actually embalmed, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other time, which was quite remarkable, we were sitting and discussing with him missile defense. This is something the Russians don't like, the United States missile defense program. And suddenly out of nowhere, Putin said, you know, the United States and Russia could work together on missile defense, just like we worked together with you during World War II on nuclear weapons. So the Americans looked at each other and we scratched our heads and we thought, is he talking about what we're talking about? And indeed he was. He then mentioned Julius Rosenberg and the people whom we would call spies, who, you know, basically gave our secrets and sold them to the Soviet Union. And so his view, he used the word kind of collaborate and work together. And there are a number of other areas where he's made interesting historical analogies. When you sit in a room with him, he doesn't smile very much. He's very serious. He's also very controlled. I think one of the few times I've seen sort of a shadow on his face, if you like, was when he was talking about how Muammar Gaddafi had died, and the way he had died, and how barbaric that was. So that's those are kind of the impressions you get of him. On the other hand, what other world leader would be willing to sit down for 2-3 hours with a group of foreigners, you know, and talk to them and answer all their questions? So it's you know, not too many. So those are just some personal impressions.
Thank you.
All right, I would say we'll take 2 more questions that are in the chat box now, and then we'll close for the evening. Do you think Putin began his rule with an already hostile view of the West? Post 9/11, cooperation is cited as a relative peak in relations with the US, but was that an aberration, or did relations decay over the 20 years since then?
So it's an interesting question. So clearly, he, you know, as a KGB agent, you know, he was raised with a hostile view of the West. On the other hand, when he first came into office, he really did appear as if he was interested in improving ties to the West. I was thinking about this with the announcement just very recently of the death of James Wolfensohn, who was a former president of the World Bank. And he recounted to me a meeting he had with Putin early on, where Putin really seemed very genuine, and he was head of the World Bank then. Putin genuinely seemed very interested in, you know, in joining the West and integrating with the West. And Putin did, after 9/11, the first person to call President Bush. And Russia certainly, this was the high point of cooperation in the post-Cold War era, where Russia was quite helpful in that first phase of the war in Afghanistan. I think the problem was that, and this comes back to it being very difficult to improve ties to Russia because we have a very different view of what productive ties would look like. I think Putin believed that in return for supporting the United States, we would recognize that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, that we wouldn't try and bring Euro-Atlantic structures, in the case of the US, NATO, closer to Russia's borders. And I think that the US perspective on that, President Bush's perspective was, we actually cleaned up Russia's backyard. I'm talking about the first 3 months of the war, when the Taliban was defeated. And that therefore, Russia should, appreciate that. And we were going to offer Russia, and we did, economic partnership and energy dialogue, things like that. So I think ever since then, Putin then felt that the West reneged on what he thought Russia would get out of this cooperation. And then he saw these color revolutions in Georgia, in Ukraine, believed that the United States was behind them. And so I think that's really what turned him against the West. If he had had ideas maybe of more cooperation. And then, of course, by 2007, he gives a speech in the Munich Security Conference where he lambasts the United States. So I mean, we don't know what was in his mind then, but I think he was more open to cooperation at the beginning, but he felt then betrayed by what happened afterwards.
Last question. Do you think Putin defines himself by any particular philosophy?
He is said to be an aficionado of a philosopher from the 1930s called Ivan Ilyin. This was someone who left after the Bolshevik Revolution. He was very conservative. He was a nationalist. He was very anti-Soviet. And he lived in Europe for the rest of his life. But yeah, nationalistic and actually pretty anti-Western. So we know that that's someone who Putin reads and he's cited. But beyond that, I come back to the fact that I think he would consider himself a Russian patriot. And that means, supporting the interests of Russia. But having said all of that, of course, there are people both in Russia and the rest of the world who look at Russia and they look at a kleptocracy and they say, all that these people are really interested in is, all of their assets, and the rest of it is all, for window dressing. I'm not sure that I believe that, but there is that other side to it too.
Thank you very much for answering all these questions. There was quite a few, but it's really good to hear your answers there on top of your wonderful presentation. Ruse, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, we have reached the end of our time, but Dr. Stent, would you be so kind to show us your book?
I actually have a poster of the latest version. This is the paperback version of it that came out in July with a new epilogue. So this
beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Stent. And thank you everyone for your participation. And Dr. Stent, again, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us. We truly appreciate this opportunity. And in closing, I would like to encourage everyone to look into purchasing Dr. Stent's book to learn more about this important topic. And a big thank you to Miriam. Miriam, thank you for everything you do every time and putting everything together, all the hard work. So very big thank you to you. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And we wish you Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a great New Year.
Okay, thank you.